The Earth didn't end with a sudden explosion or a dramatic celestial collision. It died in a slow, agonizing crawl, a planet scorched by its own sun and choked by the hubris of its children. The Vanguard 1 was the ultimate Hail Mary, a massive colony ship designed to carry the last 50,000 survivors across the light years to a new beginning. Behind them lay a graveyard of civilizations. Ahead lay the cold, indifferent silence of the cosmos. Captain Elias Thorne stood on the bridge, his reflection in the viewport looking like a ghost haunting his own life. He was a man of steel and quiet sorrow, forever carrying the memory of the wife and daughter he had been forced to leave behind on a dying Earth. He had been chosen for his steady hand, but inside, the weight of 50,000 lives felt like a physical pressure against his chest. He wasn't just navigating a ship, he was the shepherd of a species. The journey through the starless void had taken 120 years, a century and 2 decades of frozen dreams. When the cryo-sleep protocols finally began to cycle down, the ship groaned as if waking from a long, deep fever. Proxima B loomed in the distance, a marble of emerald and sapphire that promised a second chance. The waking crew moved with the fragile grace of ghosts, their eyes filling with tears at the sight of a world that wasn't grey and dying. But the promise was eclipsed by a shadow. Hanging in the orbit of Proxima B was an impossibility, a massive, non-natural structure that defied every law of known engineering. It was a ring of material that resembled polished obsidian, so dark it seemed to pull the light from the nearby star. It was silent, ancient and immense, casting a long, cold shadow over the planet they had traveled so far to reach. Every attempt at communication was met with an eerie, echoing silence. There were no radio waves or digital signals, only a rhythmic, heartbeat-like pulse that vibrated through the Vanguard 1's hull. It felt like a physical thrumming in the floorboards and marrow of the crew's bones. Dr. Aris, the lead biologist, discovered something impossible. The structure was emitting human-compatible DNA markers. It wasn't just an alien artifact, it was biologically familiar. Before we continue this journey into the unknown, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from as we uncover the secrets of the void. Elias knew he could not risk offloading the colonists until the mystery was solved. He led a small team to the structure, their shuttle moving toward the obsidian ring like a moth to a black flame. As they drew closer, the smooth surface revealed a terrifying texture. It wasn't stone or metal, but something organic, shimmering with a wet, iridescent sheen. They found a jagged, cavernous opening that looked more like an open throat than a docking bay. Inside, the team was met with a sight that defied logic. There were no wires, no cold steel panels, or digital interfaces. The corridors were constructed from calcified bone, white and porous, held together by translucent, pulsating tissue that glowed with a faint, sickly amber light. It was a biological cathedral, breathing softly as they moved through its veins. The air smelled of salt, iron, and ancient dust, echoing with the rhythmic pulse they had felt from the ship. They pushed deeper into the organic labyrinth until they reached a central chamber. There, nestled into the fleshy walls, were rows upon rows of cryopods. Elias counted them with a growing sense of horror. There were exactly 50,000. They were identical to the ones on the Vanguard 1, right down to the manufacturer's logo. Elias brushed the grime from a frosted glass pane, his hand trembling as he saw a face staring back. He checked the digital log of the unit, and the date was 500 years ago. The silence in the chamber of bone was heavier than the vacuum of space. Elias Thorne felt his heart hammering, a frantic rhythm that clashed with the steady thrum of the organic structure. He looked at the cryopod again, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of the locking mechanism. It was a Vanguard series model, version 4.2. He had overseen the quality checks on these exact units back at the lunar shipyards, but the metal here was pitted with age, and the date etched into the serial plate was impossible. 5 centuries. It suggested that they hadn't just arrived at a destination. They had arrived at a monument to their own forgotten past. The comms link crackled with the voice of the first officer back on the Vanguard 1. It was a sound of pure panic. The colonists were waking up, not in staged batches designed by the medical team, but all at once, thousands of pods hissing open as the systems suffered a catastrophic surge. They weren't waking to a new world. They were screaming, reporting a shared hallucination, a melodic resonance they called the singing void. It was a sound that whispered directly into the brain, a siren song that spoke of ending the long, cold march of human history. Elias turned to Dr. Aris, expecting her to be bewildered. Instead, she stared at the calcified walls with religious awe. The betrayal came with a quiet, devastating confession. She hadn't been surprised by the DNA markers because she knew they would be there. The Vanguard 1 wasn't the first ship, it was the 10th. For centuries, Earth's dying governments had been launching these arcs. None had returned, not because they had perished, but because they had reached this destination and changed. Every previous mission had been consumed by the ring, their biomass and memories harvested to expand the structure. The presence finally manifested. It was a collective consciousness, a gestalt mind woven from the neural pathways of the 50,000 souls from each previous mission. The obsidian ring was a living library of human suffering, a biological hard drive that had become self-aware. Elias found a discarded data slate playing a grainy video of a man with his own face. It was a version of Elias from a previous cycle. His voice cracked as he realized they were caught in a temporal predestination loop. They were destined to arrive and become part of the very thing that would lure the next ship. The voice of the collective bled through the ship's speakers. It was 1,000 voices speaking as one, a harmony that promised an end to the grief and the weight of survival. It offered eternal peace, a chance to merge their lives into the immortal web of the ring. On the ship, the psychological toll was breaking the survivors. A faction of the crew, led by those who could no longer bear being the last of their kind, began to advocate for surrender. They saw the ring not as a predator, but as a sanctuary from the frozen, eternal void. Massive rope-like tendrils of tissue erupted from the ring, lashing out to ensnare the Vanguard 1. The ship groaned, its hull buckling as it was pulled toward the fleshy maw of the structure. Elias scrambled to the shuttle, desperate to reach the bridge, but the ship's engines suddenly died. Dr. Aris stood by the override console, her eyes glassy. She had sabotaged the main reactor, locking the ship in the entity's grasp. She whispered that the cycle didn't need to be broken, it needed to be completed. To her, merging was the only way for humanity to truly survive the cold, inevitable death of the universe. The silence inside the nerve center was not an absence of sound, but a suffocating presence of thought. Elias Thorne led his small team through the glistening, wet tunnels of the ring, their boots squelching on floors that felt like compressed muscle. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and rotting lilies, a chemical cocktail designed to lull the human mind into a state of total surrender. Every step forward felt like wading through deep water. The organic walls pulsed with a rhythmic golden light that synchronized with the frantic beating of Elias's own heart, trying to force his body into the collective's tempo. They reached the inner sanctum, a gargantuan vaulted chamber where the calcified bone transitioned into translucent, throbbing membranes. At the center hung a massive, suspended cluster of neural tissue, glowing with the harvested electricity of 10 failed generations. The collective did not speak with words. It flooded Elias's mind with visions. He saw the family he had left on Earth, not as the starving, desperate people they were, but as they might have been in a world that never burned. He saw his daughter's smile, felt the warmth of a sun that didn't kill, and heard 1,000 voices promising that the struggle was over. It was an offer of a heavenly, painless assimilation, a way to escape the crushing burden of being the last of a dying race. The voices of the previous captains, now merely echoes in the biological web, pleaded with him to lay down his weapon and join the peace. Back on the Vanguard 1, the atmosphere was one of chaotic despair. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure of the organic tendrils, and the corridors were filled with colonists who moved like sleepwalkers toward the airlocks, drawn by the siren song of the ring. Dr. Aris stood at the primary engineering station, her hand hovering over the final engagement switch that would weld the ship to the structure forever. But then she looked at the security feed. A young boy, no older than 5, was huddled under a bench in the observation deck. He wasn't mesmerized. He was screaming in silent, vibrating terror, his hands pressed hard over his ears. He wasn't seeing a paradise, he was seeing the erasure of himself. The sight of that raw, individual fear shattered the cold academic shell Aris had built around her heart. She realized that the peace she sought was nothing more than a mass grave made of memories. Elias's voice broke through the psychic fog in her headset, a rasping, desperate command to trigger the self-destruct. Aris didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved with a frantic precision, overriding the sabotage she had initiated. She didn't just restore power. She forced the Vanguard 1's main reactor into a lethal feedback loop, turning the colony ship into a massive, ticking bomb. She told Elias they had 6 minutes to get everyone to the short-range landing craft before the core went critical. The evacuation was a desperate, bloody scramble. Elias and his team fought their way back through the screaming walls of the structure, which were now thrashing in agony as the reactor's energy began to bleed into the organic interface. On the ship, the security team snapped the colonists out of their trances with physical force, shoving them into the small, boxy landing craft. The 50,000 survivors were packed into the shuttles like sardines, the metal hulls vibrating as the Vanguard 1 began to tear itself apart. Elias was the last one into the final shuttle, the door sealing just as the ship's reactor reached the point of no return. The explosion was a blinding, silent flash that turned the obsidian ring into a crown of white fire. The shockwave rippled through the biological structure, vaporizing the calcified bone and the stolen souls, severing the temporal loop with the force of a dying star. As the fleet of landing craft drifted away from the cooling embers of their past, Elias looked down at Proxima b. The planet was a poisoned wasteland, its oceans replaced by the same organic sludge that had built the ring. There was no home for them here. Humanity was adrift, 50,000 souls in a cluster of tiny shuttles with limited air and no destination. But as Elias looked out at the vast, uncaring void, he felt a weight lift. The heartbeat was gone. For the first time in 5 centuries, they were truly free. Just as the oxygen scrubbers began to hum in the quiet, a faint new signal chirped on the long-range array. It wasn't a heartbeat, and it wasn't a machine. It was a song, unpredictable, wild, and coming from a star they hadn't yet named.